Okay, welcome back to part 5 of tonight's distant lecture. Um, we're going to move from the Hellenistic period and from the coast of Lebanon to Italy to look at Pompeii and a couple of Pompeian houses and the way that intercultural exchange between artists and artistic styles seems to have played out in these different kinds of spaces. So, without further ado, I want to show you just briefly a map of the city of Pompeii. Here you can see that the town is, we have a wall around the outside with several gates that lead off in different directions towards different either towns like the Porto di Nola, Porto di Sarno, Porto di Nocera, but the Porta Marina and Porta del Vesuvio, of course, both refer to natural landmarks, to the harbor and to the Mount Vesuvius, where eventually the volcano would explode and bury the town. But as you can see, it's sort of, the town is divided into basic regions with blocks of varying types, but largely orthogonal, largely sort of at right angles to one another. And we have different areas that seem to be given over more to commercial space, more to activity spaces and domestic spaces, although the zoning is mixed throughout. So down here, for example, we have a large gym as well as an amphitheater for combat sports. We have a lot of residential blocks, and oftentimes houses have small shops in the front, fronting out onto streets. So just rooms that don't directly enter into the house, or sometimes do, but look outwards and would be home to shops. And then we have the Stabian Baths and the Forum area up here with more theaters and temples, sort of large public buildings, places where people would meet and go to socialize. And then we have all these different sort of commercial and domestic spaces spread throughout the town. So where I'm going to focus first is on the House of the Faun, which is round about here. And if we look at the plan of an idealized Roman house versus the House of the Faun, there are some interesting differences to see. So in an idealized Roman house, we have an entrance at A, a vestibule and the fauces, which is a sort of a narrow entrance to the household that would be a little bit dark compared to the outside. And you would emerge again into a brightly lit space, the atrium, which is a room with a hole in the roof and a pool in the floor to catch rainwater, the compluvium impluvium technology, I guess, right? And so we have a fauces, an atrium. We have these little bedrooms spread around the sides. Here where we have room C, the cellae, if we moved these openings here in the walls to the front, that could be like the shops, right? So to either side of a household door to an entrance, you could have these little shop rooms. Then we have the alae off of the, these are wings off of the atrium, which lead back into this room G here, the tablinum, which would be sort of a household office space where the patron of the house would meet with visitors, meet with clients in the morning, do business. And then out back, we have usually a peristyle garden, peristyle being a colonnade that runs around 4 sides, and little rooms off of it, little activity and entertainment rooms off of it. So that's like a stereotypical Roman house is going to have these particular features, usually in an order similar to what we see in this diagram. So if you look at the plan of the House of the Faun, the one that we're primarily interested in right now, it's a little bit different. And in class, I was going to ask you, how is it different? Like, what are the things that you see here that make this plan not qualify for a stereotypical Roman house? So why don't you brainstorm about that, think about it, and come back to discuss that question as well. And it's probably going to get spoiled later as we move along. So One of the most famous things about the House of the Faun is its Alexander mosaic. We have visited this before. We're going to visit it again now. And the Alexander mosaic is located in an exedra here, which is a sort of a dividing space between these two gardens that we have, double peristyle gardens that we have at the House of the Faun. So if we look viewed from the entrance to the house towards the back of the house, the second peristyle garden. So we're standing in the first, we're looking through into the second. This space here is the Alexander exedra. If we've turned ourselves around 180 and we're inside the exedra looking towards the front of the house, this is the view, and you can see where the Alexander mosaic, a reproduction of the Alexander mosaic, is now in situ, where the original was discovered. And as you are all familiar with this image, here we have the Alexander mosaic itself, again done in that opus vermiculatum, that worm work, extremely tiny, millions and millions of these little tessera, these little chopped stones. You have different colors that you would arrange into sort of paint stroke lines to create shading and depth and all of the outlines in this image. So if we look at the Alexander mosaic, there's a really faithful interest, again, similar to what we saw in the Alexander sarcophagus, to representing the specific artistic styles of the people, the way that they wore their culture on their bodies. So we have, for example, the Persian king Darius with his extremely fancy, very tall version of this Persian hat. We have his cape with, actually, if you look closely, you can see a double snake-headed torque, a necklace around his neck, so a heavy sort of metal object. You can see on his very fancy chariot with its very fancy wheels here, actually tiny little lions and animals inlaid into the wooden body of the chariot. So really heavy on the detail, similar to what we saw with the painting on the inside of the shields, to show the artistic saturation of the battlefield itself, right? So we have art depicting a battle, but it's also showing the way that art appeared on a battlefield in the form of people's arms and armor, and the way that they would have them be highly decorated objects. So here we have Darius himself and his charioteer pulling him away as Alexander the Great comes in from the left with his pila, his very long spear, and his own suite of culturally circumscribed armor, right? Here he has the Greek plate armor with an aegis of, so a head on his breastplate that probably is an apotropaic, scaring off evil Medusa, similar to what we see, for example, on the aegis of Athena, the goddess Athena, who always has that Medusa head on her breastplate. And then we have his, his sword here, a very fancy leather bridle on his horse. So sort of from top to bottom, we even see the little sort of thongs that he is using to tie the pieces of armor to one another. So we have a real level of saturation of detail, and both to the foreign culture, the Persians, right? If we're assuming that this is a Hellenistic painting, mosaic based on Hellenistic painting, as we talked about before, from about 100 BC in this Roman house that was originally Samnite and becomes Roman. That's too much. Anyway, so we have saturation of the details, not only of the artistic qualities of Persian art and armor and architecture, not architecture, art and armor, but also of Greek art and armor as well. Moving on. If we look a little bit more closely at the sort of chaos of battle here, a lot of things emerge. I was curious if anyone would look at this and come back and discuss what is awkward about this composition, if there's anything that sort of, if you look at it very closely, catches your eye and looks strange or hard to follow, and if you think that that is on purpose or if it serves some sort of visual purpose or not. I have my own ideas. We can talk about those a little bit more in depth. But again, thinking about that sort of narrative scene, if we look at the Alexander mosaic, it's really showing in detail and also showing in sympathy both sides of the battle. We have these Macedonians. We also have this great pathos of these Persians who are one being stabbed here, this one trying to control his horse, and then we have this one down here that I think I showed you before who is being crushed. As you can see his reflection in the shield, looking up, looking sort of for help, and sort of looking directly at you as the viewer at the same time. So it's not the only mosaic in the house, and I actually want to sort of set up an activity here that I would like you to do. If you look at these next slides, this first one you will recognize from your exam, I hope. This is a strip of mosaic that runs right along the border of the Alexander mosaic. So if you're standing with your feet on the ground looking down at the Alexander mosaic in front of you, this is the border that separates your feet from the mosaic itself. So it's another opus vermiculata mosaic. It is a nilotic scene, so we're going to be looking at more nilotic scenes in a minute. But I think there's some really interesting comparisons to be made between why you might want to pair a scene of a Hellenistic battle between Alexander the Great and the Persians with this nilotic scene, both from a historic and from an iconographic point of view. So maybe do some brainstorming and thinking about that. Here's just a close-up of that mosaic, so you can see some of the detail and the way that it is rendered really beautifully and painterly. And then the next few slides here are mosaics from the House of the Faun, and I've marked on the plan where in the house the mosaic shows up. So what I would like you to do, and I will provide some sort of more official written version of this, is to think about moving through this house as a house and coming into contact with these various mosaics. So you start with theatrical masks and bountiful garlands at the entrance to the house. You move through, and if you turned into the first cubiculum on your left as you walk through the fauces, you would find this erotic mosaic between a woman and a satyr, who you can tell by his elongated ears is not fully human. Continuing on, if we went to this ala on the left here, you would see these doves. And these recall a really famous Greek painting of doves stealing beads from a box, but are done in a completely different style, a completely different artistic style that's very cute. And then opposite, in the room sort of on the other side of the space here, we have more very painterly mosaics, a still life with ducks here and fish and sea mollusks, and above we have this cat and bird combination. Then we have in the sort of triclinium dining and entertainment space behind, the sea mosaic that I showed you on the very first day of class and that is on our syllabus. So if you remember, I talked about this being in literary sources a depiction of a sort of rock, paper, scissors, where the octopus kills the lobster, the eel kills the octopus, and the lobster kills the eel. So you have this sort of cycles of nature operating in this teeming sea scene. And then finally we have in, again, sort of the paired room to that sea scene, a cherub holding a very sort of a glass thing of grapes, riding on the back of a tiger. So we had this sort of very mythological Hellenizing scene in opposite of this sea scene. So the question to sort of think about is, taken together, how do these mosaics create an overall impression to a visitor to the house by drawing upon different cultural and even mythological imagery? How do these things combine into one? So think about those questions and come back together and discuss them next week.